The Marxism of the Current Era by J. Sykes. So far in our series on theory, we've looked at the historical emergence of Marxism. But by the time Marx finished writing Capital, capitalism was still developing and changing. The fundamental characteristics of the capitalist mode of production haven't changed. Commodity production and exploitation of workers' surplus value by the capitalists remains the driving force of the capitalist system. And it remains a system plagued by regular cycles of crises of overproduction, pushing poor and working class people further down while the rich get richer and richer. But by the beginning of the 20th century, the internal motion of capitalism's contradictions led to its advancement to a higher stage, monopoly capitalism, also known as imperialism. As capitalism developed to this higher stage, Marxism needed to advance to come to grips with the demands that imperialism placed upon the international working class, theoretically and practically. By and large, the mainstream Marxists of the time had begun to treat Marxism as a dogma rather than a living science. They failed to understand this shift and proved inadequate to the demands that imperialism placed on the working class. The leader of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, took up this task of understanding this new stage, and on the basis of that understanding developed the strategy and tactics of proletarian revolution. Huge strides were made in the Great October Revolution of 1917 in Russia, where the Bolsheviks established the first socialist state, the Soviet Union. Through the course of the October Revolution and socialist construction, the leaders of the Bolsheviks, especially Lenin and Stalin, further developed Leninism as the Marxism of the era of imperialism and proletarian revolution. Let's break down the contributions of Leninism to Marxism here before we go into greater detail in forthcoming articles in our series. First, Lenin clarified the terrain of struggle in developing his analysis of the current stage of capitalism, especially in his Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. He said that imperialism had 5 basic characteristics. 1. The concentration of production and capital has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. 2. The merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation, on the basis of this finance capital, of a financial oligarchy. 3. The export of capital as distinguished from the export of commodities acquires exceptional importance. 4. The formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which share the world amongst themselves. And 5. The territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers is completed. Based on this, Lenin understood that imperialism is capitalism in decay, that imperialist powers could extract super profits through the exportation of capital to the oppressed nations and the super exploitation of the people there to hold off the system's own inevitable demise. Lenin thus understood that capitalism developed unevenly. The monopoly capitalist states were able to grow very advanced at the expense of the rest of the world, which was held in a lower stage of development due to imperialist exploitation. Based on this analysis, Lenin recognized the tremendous revolutionary importance of the anti-imperialist struggle for national liberation in the oppressed nations, and gave central importance to the right of nations to self-determination as a cornerstone of proletarian internationalism. Stalin, himself from one of the oppressed nations of the Russian Empire, played a pivotal role in developing the Leninist understanding of the national question. His essay, Marxism and the National Question, is the cornerstone to the Leninist understanding of the role of the oppressed nationalities and the demand for national self-determination. This analysis of imperialism was epoch-defining. According to Stalin, the rise of imperialism brings forward 3 fundamental contradictions, or defining struggles of the current era: the contradiction between labor and capital, the contradiction between the imperialist countries amongst themselves, and between the imperialist countries and the oppressed nations. The socialist revolutions would create a 4th contradiction between the socialist and the imperialist countries. Stalin explained in the Foundations of Leninism that because imperialism represents a new stage of capitalism, the contributions of Lenin are universally applicable, and that Marxism-Leninism is the Marxism of the current era. In organizing the revolution in Russia, this theory of uneven development also played an important role. Many Marxists once thought revolution would first happen in the most advanced capitalist countries. Lenin argued that the imperialist stage of capitalism meant that revolution should first develop in the weak links of the capitalist chain, and he believed that Russia was just such a weak link. History proved Lenin correct. In his pamphlet, What is to be Done, Lenin also put forward the theory of the party of the new type, a communist party of professional revolutionaries in the vanguard of the working class, cadres organized according to the principles of democratic centralism, who would work shoulder to shoulder in the mass movements of working and oppressed people. In practice, this meant fusing Marxism with the movements of workers and peasants in Russia through the class struggle, and building the Communist Party through that struggle. Importantly, Lenin also developed the theory that the revolution in semi-feudal countries like Russia should develop in stages. The working class and their party could and should lead the revolutionary movement directly from the bourgeois democratic revolution to the proletarian socialist revolution. First, the overthrow of semi-feudal society requires a broad people's democracy, led by the working class in alliance with the peasantry. In Russia, this stage lasted from 1903 to February 1917, and had as its objective the overthrow of Tsarism and the remnants of medievalism. The Foundations of Leninism sums up this stage well. Stalin points out that the main force at this first stage was the proletariat relying on the entire peasantry as the reserve force, and that the revolution was directed at isolating the liberal monarchist bourgeoisie, who sought compromise with Tsarism. The firm alliance between the proletariat and peasantry was crucial to prevent the peasantry, as a basically petty bourgeois or small-time capitalist class, from being won over to the idea of compromise. Then, after the overthrow of the Tsar, the revolution entered its second stage. This stage spanned from March to October 1917, with the objective of overthrowing imperialism and withdrawing from the imperialist war. The core of this stage was the alliance of the proletariat with the poor peasants to defeat the bourgeoisie and prevent the peasantry and other petty bourgeois strata from going over to the side of the imperialists. The establishment of socialism depended on the success of this second stage, and during both stages the leadership of the working class was essential. After this, it became possible to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, consolidate socialism in one country, and use that country as a base area from which the international communist movement could battle against imperialism more broadly. Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, along with the 1938 History of the CPSU Bolsheviks short course, by summing up the process of the revolution in Russia and breaking down clearly the stages of its advance, serves as a masterclass for the application of Leninism's universal lessons for revolutionaries all over the world. This theoretical understanding of revolutionary stages has proved tremendously important for revolutionaries in countries as diverse as Cuba, Vietnam, and China. Lenin further understood that the old bourgeois state machinery couldn't be used to build socialism. Socialism couldn't be achieved by reforming the bourgeois state, but rather it must be smashed and replaced by the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. As the African-American poet Audre Lorde later put it, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. On this basis, Lenin led the struggle against opportunists and revisionists in Russia and in the international communist movement as a whole, and led the Soviet people in the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is, the establishment of working-class state power in the largest country in the world. Led by the only class with no material interest in the exploitation of others, the elimination of all exploitation becomes possible. The Soviet Union gave the international working class a base for the first time in world history, and was a beacon and an inspiration to people all over the world for more than 70 years. In his pamphlet, The State and Revolution, Lenin argued that after the consolidation of socialism and the progressive elimination of the reasons for its existence, the dictatorship of the proletariat would eventually wither away as it deliberately and methodically developed the forces of production, eliminating capitalist relations of production, and transitioned step by step to a classless, stateless society, communism. Then the material conditions would be in place for Marx's slogan of, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, to be truly realized. Up to this point, our series has covered the historical emergence of Marxism and its development into its current stage, Marxism-Leninism. Next, we will look more deeply at the philosophy at the center of Marxism-Leninism. In our next several articles, we will look at the Marxist-Leninist theory of knowledge, which stands at the very core of the science of revolution. Leninism, the Marxism of the Current Era, by J. Sykes, published by Fight Back News.
Robot Zoom voice. So I'm Andy. I am the Freedom Road Socialist Organization National Organizer, and I'm currently in our national office. I want to welcome everybody to our Red Theory study sessions. This is a series of online studies.
This is a guided meditation on peace, presentness, and political revolution. Find a place where you can sit comfortably, perhaps resting your hands on your knees. You may wish to sit on the floor with your legs crossed. Or, if you're not too tired, you may like to lie down on your back. Whatever position suits you. Make sure that your chest is open, and you may wish to allow your eyes to gently close, or find a point in the room where you can rest your focus. Begin by noticing your breathing. Feel your chest rising and falling, your belly expanding in and out. You don't have to change the way you breathe, just becoming aware of it. In and out. Notice also that society can be thought of as being made up of groups of people with conflicting and irreconcilable economic interests, which we call classes. You don't have to change society in this moment. This is your moment, your time. Just notice class conflict and be aware of it. This will be our anchor as we proceed on this journey. And now, let's take 3 deep, relaxing breaths. As you release the air in your lungs, you may wish to repeat in your mind the topics of today's meditation. And with each breath, I invite you to experience a doubling of your relaxation. Let's take the first of these 3 breaths. Now, breathing in, peace, and out. Very good. Breathing normally in between, becoming even more relaxed. third and final breath. Now, breathing in, political revolution, and out. Well done. Don't worry if your breathing doesn't match the sound of my voice. It is all good, and it is all okay. Just becoming even more aware of breath, and beginning slowly to relax. As we breathed those 3 relaxing breaths, you may have noticed a slight tingling sensation spreading from the top of your head down through your shoulders, arms, chest, right out the tips of your toes. This sensation is available to you throughout this meditation, whenever you desire. Don't be distressed or upset if you become distracted by thoughts or sounds in the room. Just keep coming back to breath. The world can be chaotic, and we can lose focus when we think about what we might like to change, or something we wish we could control. But just invite yourself to come back to breath and the model of class conflict. Breathing in and out. As you sink deeper and deeper into this relaxed state of awareness, you may begin to notice the position of your body, the surfaces you are in contact with, the temperature of the room. And you may also notice your body's position in the system of global capitalism. And the air continues to flow, becoming even more relaxed, even more aware. Now, in this relaxed state, we are ready to consider the revolution. As you breathe in and out, receive an invitation to the idea that revolution will look different for you if you are in a bourgeois nation enriched by global capitalism than it might for someone in a country impoverished by it. Returning always to breath and class conflict. When we think about revolution, we may imagine it as destructive or violent. We may conjure images of past revolutions that we think fell short, or make jokes about sending landlords and capitalists to violent ends. We may shy away from this image, whether because we are liberals rather than socialists, or because we were raised in liberal capitalist societies that maintain a hold on our thoughts, or perhaps out of compassion and love for our fellow human beings, whoever they may be. Whatever the reason, we may desire to avoid revolution, but simply agitate for reform within capitalist society, while maintaining its comforts. But although revolution means a break with the old ways of doing things, it need not be fundamentally destructive, but instead an act of creation. is the birthing of a new way of life, rather than the gradual managing of decay and bargaining with entropy that liberal democracy has become. This is not to say that we cannot learn from our mistakes or come to an understanding of history. Simply that, in considering the revolution, we want our focus to be on the present and not our anxieties about the past. Do not judge yourself if you have doubts. Simply observe them and let them go. We may become anxious or depressed when we ruminate on the past and witness the destruction and pain that can seem to surround us. We can be upset by the wickedness of others and wonder how it is that human beings can have done so many awful things to each other or the planet. Conversely, we may rejoice at small changes that we have managed to win in the past through elections and trade unions in the struggle for a fairer world. But the past is not real and exists only in our memories, in the present, where breath and class conflict remain, and where we want our focus to be. Breathing in, peace, and out. Each breath deepening your relaxation and your awareness. When we are not dwelling on the past, we often project our thoughts about revolution into the future, as if it will be some messianic event, waiting just out of reach, that will save us from the frightening things in our world. But the future also does not exist. It is only anticipation in the present moment. When we think of the revolution as a specific event, like an armed uprising that will take place in the future, we can become concerned about whether our actions take us closer to our idea of that event or farther away. We may become fixated on the purity of our vision, focusing only on the ideal, classless future, and neglecting other forms of oppression that others struggle against in the here and now. Or we may become anxious, thinking that it is an impossible task, or that we would have nothing to contribute, imagining instead that the future revolution will be led by anti-fascist catgirls or revolutionary daddies who will do the fighting for us. This can turn us against each other, or make us doubt ourselves, wondering whether what we or those around us are doing is truly revolutionary or merely reform. It is okay to have these doubts. Simply recognize them and return to the present moment, to breath, and the desire to abolish the class system. By noticing and letting go of doubts, and not judging ourselves or others for having them, we become prepared to take and wield power in the present, to neither retreat into ruminating on how we present moment to realize the energy inside of ourselves that we can use to lead the revolution. Now, breathing in presentness and out. When we look at the revolution either as a distant project of the future or the redemption of the past, we often imagine it as a moral crusade, springing from the best impulses of our hearts, and someday bringing about a lasting justice. But this way of thinking can also bind us and stop us from seeing a way forward in the present. It is easy to become overwhelmed or disappointed when our own sense of justice is not met, and to become concerned with how the resources of our world are distributed, rather than the conditions under which they are extracted and produced. We stray from the present and class conflict, and it is easy to conflate our moral desire for a better world with the ideals of participation in bourgeois democracies in which we are raised. That is not to say that we must abandon our moral ideals or close our hearts to democratic participation or the suffering of others, or that our smaller efforts to make the world a better place are necessarily a misuse of our time. It is merely to appreciate that a revolution is more than a change in the distribution of goods, or a struggle to get a slightly fairer deal. It is the struggle to abolish the causes of that injustice, not merely its symptoms, which are fleeting and can flare up chaotically as long as class conflict persists. Breathing in, political revolution, and out, aware of your chest, your belly, that tingling sensation in your head, shoulders, chest, and down through your legs. You may become aware that you are holding tension in your neck, or your jaw, or cognitive tension brought about by trying to reconcile the internal contradictions of capitalism. With your next breath, just invite any tense muscles to let go. In a moment, we will count backwards from 5 and gradually return to our normal awareness. But first, take a moment to suspend yourself in this relaxed state, as if deep in an ocean. The waves sway overhead, but you are still and calm. And now we will begin to surface with 5 short phrases. You may wish to repeat them in your mind or out loud, whatever is best for you. Beginning with 5. I am aware of my breath. And now complex conflict. Breathing in and out with 2. I am aware of the revolutionary energy inside me. And now, finally, 1. I embrace revolution in the present moment. Fantastic job. If you wish, you can stay in this relaxed state for as long as you desire. Or you may wish to continue your day renewed with this energy. Just remember to allow your awareness to always return to breath and the present moment, and the desire to abolish the class system.
Online studies that we're doing for general members. And it's based on a series of Fight Back News articles that were authored by Jay Sykes, who is on this call. There's a whole bunch of articles that cover a broad range of topics, kind of building up the building blocks of Marxism, Leninism in nice little chunks that have a lot of detail still, even though it is, kind of breaks it down. So I think it strikes a really good balance between being introductory, but also in depth. My co-host is Chris Lee. You want to introduce yourself?
Yes, definitely. My name is Chris Carpio. I'm located in Tampa, and I am on the standing committee of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. And I'm also the leader of the Student Commission, too. So if anyone ends up doing student work in our group, I'm sure we will talk again in closer quarters. But yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andy. So without further ado, I think we can go into our presentation now. Sounds good. All right. So this week we asked folks to read, because we covered the first 2 articles in our last meeting. So this one was just the next one. And it was about Leninism. The title is Leninism, the Marxism of the Current Era. So this one is where we lay out, well, okay, we established what Marxism was and what Marx did and wrote to advance on the ideas at the time. So, how did that get elevated to Marxism-Leninism? Essentially, it's the application of Marxism to the current conditions at that time, and which, are still conditions or still contradictions in our world today, and therefore is still the strategy that we want to use and that other countries have used to have revolution, right? Socialist revolution. So the fundamental contradictions of capitalism have not changed. The fundamental contradiction of, all the ownership of the means of production being private, and yet it's produced in a socialized way by the working class that gets bigger and bigger, and they don't get to take home any of it. That has still given, was still giving rise to commodity production and exploitation of workers, surplus value, regular crises of overproduction, the gap between the rich and the poor getting larger and larger. So those things are still, still fundamentally happening going into the 20th century, but they were advancing to a higher stage, right? The situation was developing into what we call its final stage, imperialism or monopoly capitalism. Those terms mean the same thing. And it was important that Lenin actually analyzed the conditions for what they were, because there were a lot of dogmatic views at the time of what exactly imperialism was, right? So if you ever hear the name Kautsky, he had the view that it was just industrial capital taking over agrarian areas, which, that's not correct, because how would that explain then, like any of the world wars, right? You had the view that ultra-imperialism meant the imperialists were all going to merge together to end war one day, because they kept just merging, right? That's also incorrect, and, devastatingly incorrect. Like, if you can't take a good line on the wars, you're going to betray the people. So it was actually, Lenin was kind of like on the forefront of coming up with this analysis, and it was due to not only the writers that came before him, but the fact that he and the Bolsheviks were actively partaking in the Russian Revolution. And needed this analysis because of their, the Russian Empire having, kind of like all these people that they were oppressing, and, kind of like this peasant population. So this analysis would actually become the basis of the strategy and tactics that they would use for the Russian Revolution. So it wasn't just analysis, it was, it was alive, right? It was alive and being used to get rid of the Tsar. And in doing so, the Bolsheviks established the first socialist state, the Soviet Union, from which a lot of people have learned a ton, and which we still learn from today. And, they're unfortunately no longer around. But it was with the Soviet Union that, under the leadership of Lenin and Stalin, the people began socialist construction and developed Leninism as the Marxism of the era of imperialism, so our final stage of capitalism in its dying days, and proletarian revolution. So that's what we refer to when we say Marxism-Leninism, is Marxism in this last stage of capitalism. Now, what exactly was this analysis of imperialism that Lenin had? Well, he looked at the internal contradictions, and he saw that imperialism was capitalism that had 5 basic characteristics, because it had reached, it's this certain point. It was meeting these 5 conditions. So the production and capital was getting concentrated into the hands of fewer and fewer capitalists, right? They play to win, right? Like, you might have competition at first in the early days, but they will do anything to take each other out. They will make deals with each other. They will use espionage, the market will, they will operate in the market until they destroy each other and they buy out their smaller competitors. So you do end up getting a few monopoly capitalists who will dominate an industry, and something as simple as Pepsi Cola and what other few soda companies will show you how prominent that is, or the prominence of companies like General Electric. So eventually that innovative competition stage will end, and you'll have a few monopoly capitalists. You can still have competitors coming up in a little bit, but there's going to be dominating companies. You have the creation of finance capital, because you will have bank capital that merges with industrial capital. The emergence of banks changes up the game, because with the ability to kind of give out loans and control interest rates, they can actually help certain capitalists, kind of beat the others, but then they themselves are actually becoming more powerful because they're making money off of it, So that was a new thing that was arising, and a financial oligarchy was arising, and they would actually become more powerful than the manufacturing capitalists or the agrarian capitalists, right? So, that was also new. You had the export of capital becoming dominant over just the export of commodities, right? Like, instead of just selling the textiles and the clothes directly to the Indian people, now you had a stage where you could actually buy and control all the forces in the Indian economy, right? In the case of the British, right? So the scale of kind of this, the economic domination was like drastically increasing, is more profitable. You had the formation of international monopoly capitalist associations, which would share the world among themselves, right? So you'll have like different agreements between different imperialist powers for a time, right? So, if people know about NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which had Canada and Mexico, in the U.S. in it, the U.S. was attempting to build the TPP with a bunch of countries across Asia, Trans-Pacific Partnership, they use these to try to, win, right? And then the territorial division of the world among the biggest capitalist powers is complete, right? So, it's done, and now the imperialist powers are going to battle to, get as much as they can, and the reason for that is they need to dominate these markets. They're making all this, they're making all these products, and they're they have all these industries, but who's going to buy them? All the workers who have no money, whose wages keep going down. No, eventually the sales will plateau, and they need more people to buy them, and they don't care that India needs to develop its own economy. They need new markets. They'll do anything to get it. So he analyzed that it was changing in these ways, and that imperialism was actually capitalism in decay, right? They're only desperately going to these oppressed nations. Well, they do get the massive super profits from it, but it's to hold off the inevitable demise of the imperialist economy, right? They know that they can't actually sustain this. They can't keep getting wealthy and making money off the way they've invested. It's got, and capitalism has its built-in crises. It's because, we're just going, the gap between the rich and the poor is just going to get wider and wider, and they, we're not, disposable income is not going to increase, right? So, when we talk about the analysis of imperialism, Lenin those were kind of the 5 things he saw happening. Now, what are the implications? It means that capitalism was developing unevenly across different nations, and deliberately on the part of the imperialist powers, right, on the imperialist nations. So they were going to deliberately unevenly develop. They were going to they're going to develop at the expense of the rest of the world, right? And they will actually benefit from holding those other countries at a lower stage of economic development. So if there's a question of why India still has, this kind of semi-feudal character, why the Philippines has a semi-feudal character, it's because, the U.S. benefits from the Philippines not developing their own economy to kick out the American economies, right? So Lenin actually, in seeing this, he gave central importance to the rights of nations to self-determination and national liberation as being a cornerstone of revolution and proletarian internationalism. This was actually where imperialism was going to be really weak, was with the oppressed peoples, and therefore there's a lot to fight, right? This was actually a demand of the people that maybe, even if it wasn't socialist in character, it would still be, it could still lead to a revolution, just the fight for democratic rights, right? And it would actually be Stalin who would go on to expand on these ideas in Marxism and the National Question, which are highly, highly, highly recommended to everyone here. We actually read it with people we're recruiting as cadre as well, because it's, he actually explains kind of more in depth kind of the nuances of what we call the national question, and it's really, really good. So Lenin was coming up with this analysis and then seeing therefore the imperialism means that the fight for national liberation is going to be key to proletarian internationalism. Marxists absolutely need to be part of this fight. So Stalin looked at all of this, and then he identified 3 fundamental contradictions across the world in this new stage. So the contradiction between labor and capital, so the monopoly capitalists and the international working class, the contradiction between the imperialist countries among themselves, right, because they're trying to take each other out, and then between the imperialist countries and the impressed nations. And then we actually, learning from the Albanians, we adopted the view that there's also a fourth contradiction in the world created by the socialist revolutions now between the socialist countries and the capitalist countries, right? So there's actually, that, and, these four contradictions still exist in the world today, and we think they drive all changes in society. Now, this theory of uneven development and the importance of national liberation would play a very vital role in the Russian Revolution. There were a lot of arguments at the time that you had to have highly developed capitalism before you could have socialism, and that's like Trotsky was one of the big writers about that. He called it permanent revolution, but Lenin actually argued that because the weak links in the capitalist chain would often be the oppressed nations, it was actually they were very good candidates to have revolution first, and he believed Russia was a weak link, because even though it was an imperialist power, in all these imperialist wars, it was definitely kind of one of the more backward of the European powers. It had the population was still mostly peasants, right? Recently, serfs, right? And then you had kind of all these other groups in the Russian Empire, like Georgians and different nationalities, right? And history proved Lenin correct. Russia actually was capable of having a revolution, and it was built on this analysis of the importance of national liberation. So those are key concepts, and we in the United States know that there are oppressed nations here as well. So it's key for our own strategy that we want to unite those groups with the multinational working class, and that also we still have these contradictions, and the U.S. is still battling these other countries abroad. So what does that mean for what we should do? It informs kind of every step in our work. Last thing I'll say too is all of this also uncovered the idea that revolution in semi-feudal countries like Russia should develop in stages, or could develop in stages, right? Where there might be a fight first for bourgeois democratic rights, right? So something like the right to vote, or the right for even just a smaller group to own property or whatever. For the capitalists to own property, but that you could actually, with the leadership of the working class, fight also for a proletarian socialist revolution, that the working class could lead both stages, and we actually want to build that, and we think that countries like China built that, right? The Russians succeeded. The first stage involved a broad people's democracy in order to overthrow the Tsar and feudalism. It had the working class in alliance with the peasantry, although Stalin wrote that at this point it was still mostly the proletariat relying on the peasantry as the reserve force in order to isolate the elements of the bourgeoisie who wanted to compromise with the Tsar, and that this unity was necessary in order to win. And then the second stage was, at this point, Russia was in World War I, and so the demands were about getting people out of that war. And after the overthrow of the Tsar, you were able to actually get to the stage where you could overthrow imperialism, again, hinging on the alliance of the proletariat with the peasantry in order to defeat the bourgeoisie, expose the kind of new bourgeoisie, the former Mensheviks who joined up with the bourgeoisie, who were still keeping the people in World War I, and then keeping the petty bourgeoisie and the peasantry from going to the side of the imperialists, right? So that was, the during both stages, the working class was in leadership because the Bolsheviks made sure of that, actively brought this theory to the working class, and that leadership was essential to win. So I just wanted to talk about those aspects of the contributions of Leninism, and with that, I'll turn it over to my co-host, Andy.
Thanks, Chrisley. So Another key contribution of Leninism, like we've said in the past section, that the working class, took leadership. It kind of brings up the question of how did the communists and the lead the working class to lead the whole masses of the people to carry out this revolution. And one of the key contributions of Leninism is the concept of the vanguard party. So Lenin laid the ideas for the concept of a vanguard party in his book, What is to Be Done. He called it a party of a new type, because this was distinguished from a lot of the socialist parties at the time were more geared towards parliamentary, like getting elected into parliament and trying to pass legislation. And Lenin proposed that instead of putting all your energy into that you needed a communist party composed of professional revolutionaries that were the vanguard or the leading group of the working class, and that this party, this new type of party, would be organized along principles of democratic centralism. So democracy and debate around what to do, but then a very strict discipline that allows the whole organization to act in unison. And that these cadre, the members of this party, would also be working shoulder to shoulder in the mass movements of working and oppressed people. So the Bolsheviks built this party, and they fused the theoretical contributions of Marxism with the on-the-ground actual movements of workers and peasants in the class struggle. And it was with this type of organization that they were able to carry out their revolution. So the next the last important aspect of Leninism, or important contribution of Leninism to Marxism, that we'll talk about today, is the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So when the Bolsheviks, led the people of Russia to overthrow the provisional government and to begin, set up what they called a dictatorship of the proletariat. And they began to consolidate socialism in Russia, in one country. Well, not just Russia, but what would eventually become the Soviet Union. And this essentially gave the international communist movement, which was, workers' movements scattered throughout the world, but without state power in any one country. It really changed the game and allowed the international communist movement to heighten the level of struggle against imperialism now that they had state power. One of the important things that Lenin realized was that socialism could not be achieved by reforming the bourgeois state. So you can't just elect socialist politicians into the bourgeois parliament or to higher offices and pass laws that will gradually transition it into socialism. You have to smash the bourgeois state and replace it by the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. This kind of concept is captured eloquently by the African-American poet Audre Lorde, by saying the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Well, the bourgeois police are never going to turn against capital. You have to smash them, disband them, and build a state that serves the working class, and that is the dictatorship of the proletariat. So in order to theoretically prepare the way for this course of action, Lenin did a lot of polemic, which is kind of a theoretical public argument with opportunists and revisionists in Russia and around the world. And he fought for this concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is, without, if you take away the kind of Marxist jargon, it's basically just putting the working class in state power. Some really good books that cover this topic include Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, the 1938 History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks short course. And both of these cover the process of the revolution in Russia and break it down into the stages that it used to advance. So I'm going to drop the titles of those readings in the chat here. So this understanding of revolutionary stages has been important for revolutions in countries all around the world, including Cuba, Vietnam, China. The Soviet Union gave the international working class a real base for the first time in world history and was a beacon and an inspiration to people all over the world for more than 70 years. And Lenin's thoughts on the dictatorship of the proletariat went beyond what has been practically achieved even today. He projected the thoughts that with the consolidation of socialism, eventually the dictatorship of the proletariat would wither away, or it would dissipate as the need for a state went away, as the material conditions that necessitated it no longer were the case. And this, some of these things that would take society towards no longer requiring a state would be, revolution and socialism all around the world. So the elimination of external imperialist threats, the development of the forces of production in socialist society, so making society more materially productive, and eliminating capitalist relations of production. And with these developments, society could transition to a classless and therefore stateless society, which is called communism. This would be the material foundations for Marx's maxim for how communism will function, which is from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. So I think it's important that Marxist-Leninists, we don't consider this an idealistic goal. We, it's not a utopia. It's a state of affairs that requires certain material conditions to exist, and we believe that Marxism-Leninism is the path to eventually get there. And the working class has a special role to play in achieving communism and leading the way towards communism through socialism, because it's the only class that has no material interest in the exploitation of others. So that's why we think that the working class has a special revolutionary potential to lead society to communism. So that concludes our presentations, the presentation section of the study session tonight, and we're going to open it up for questions. We want to prioritize questions from people, from oppressed people, first of all, and also from people that feel that they may not be as comfortable with these readings. If you feel like you're already an expert on this topic, we do want to hear from you. but we want to make sure that people who aren't as confident with these topics have an opportunity to ask their questions, because that's really who we want to, if somebody has doesn't understand some part of this or wants to know more about a certain section, we really want to encourage you to ask the questions, because that's really what these studies are for, is to help people learn and grow their understanding of Marxism so that we can use it as the guide to action. Because for us, all of this, it's not just about mastering a particular area of knowledge, or being good at being able to debate these things. We want to put this into practice, and we want you guys to put this into practice, through mass work, just like Marx and just like Lenin and the Bolsheviks did. So with that, we'll open it up for questions. You can drop your question in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function, and then I'll be able to unmute you, and you can ask the question. Yeah, you can, so if you want to send a question, you can just send it to the hosts, to me or Chrisley. All right, Brian, I'm gonna unmute you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's kind of a two-part question. The first one is a little bit more out of curiosity, which is like in practical, like material terms, like what was the alliance between the proletariat and the peasants? Like how exactly was that forged? And then the other question was, I mean, given that we're not in a semi-feudal society, nor a advanced industrial society so much anymore in America, where it's more of like a service industry, like, do you guys have any opinions on like how like Lenin's analysis of Russia would change like the revolutionary conditions here?
Okay. Thanks, Brian.
You wanna take any of that, Andy, or you want me to take a stab at it? Or
Yeah, go for it.
There were two questions in that. Okay. So in the Russian Revolution, you had the workers agitating in the cities, having, kind of, as the Bolsheviks got more and more successful, more and more strikes. But then you also had the peasants having like uprisings, basically, in the countryside, right? And there were a lot of idealist forces saying that, Trotsky was one of them, but I'm sure there were others, saying that the peasants had capitalist bourgeois demands, capitalist bourgeois demands of land, right? So we don't need to pull them into the revolution of the movement, like it should just be workers only. It's essentially what he was saying, and Lenin said that wasn't correct for all the reasons we laid out tonight. And then as the Bolsheviks actually, after the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks split, then the Bolsheviks would actually organize not only the workers, but also try to organize the peasants and pull people into the party so that people all had the same goal, which was first getting rid of the Tsar, and then getting rid of the imperialists, right? So that was that's an important part of kind of the way that the revolution came out. So it was that alliance of interest, but also going in practically to meet those peasants. Now, the second part of the question. Well, I could keep going, but Andy, do you want to take a stab at it? I think I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I think so. The Bolsheviks recognized that the vast majority of the population was still peasants, and so they correctly saw that, okay, if we're gonna have a real revolution that has the support of the masses, we definitely have to take the needs and demands of the peasants into account. And some of the revolutionary slogans that the Bolsheviks used was peace, land, and bread. I think also the fact that so two of those, the demand for land, is specifically a demand to win the support of the peasants and to articulate their desires. But also most of the soldiers, because they're most of the population, but also most of the army, most of the conscripts into the army in World War I were peasants. So some workers were conscripted, but mostly the Tsar and the Russian Empire wanted to preserve the little industrial capacity that they had. So most of the soldiers were drawn from the peasantry. So peace was also a popular demand among the peasant masses as well. So I'd say those are some ways that there was concrete solidarity. But the Bolsheviks also knew that if the working class wasn't in the lead, the direction of society wasn't going to be a progressive one. Like if peasants, and peasant demands were kind of calling all the shots and the vision for society, you'd kind of end up with a pretty backwards, underdeveloped country. So there was an alliance between the workers and the peasants, but the working class was still in the lead.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that great detail, Andy. And then I wanted to also kind of speak to that second question you had about how do we apply this to the U.S. today, even though it's got a lot of service industry. Well, the fundamental contradictions are, even if more, the imperialists send more manufacturing overseas because it's cheaper, you still have Wall Street, and they're still doing what they were doing at the time Lenin came up with all these ideas. In fact, you have Wall Street in the U.S. So that makes it even more important for us to kind of do all of this, right? And you actually you have uneven development within the United States as well, right? Like you'll have higher mortality rates, lower rates of having health insurance, poorer schools, more poverty within the oppressed nations, such as in Aslan in the Southwest, and then famously in the Black Belt South, right? For not only like African American people in the South, but also anyone living in the South, including like white people in the South, will have lower rates of health insurance than even African Americans living outside of the nation, right? So that's pretty interesting. And basically the point being that the uneven development exists within the U.S. and it affects everyone, brings everyone down, but disproportionately the oppressed nationalities. So even with more service industry, it doesn't really change the state of things.
Yeah, and I would also say, like the existence of service industry, a lot of service industry jobs, that doesn't change the fundamental exploitative relationship between the capitalist and the worker. They may not be manufacturing products, but they are still generating they're generating surplus value that goes to the profit of the capitalist rather than seeing the full value that they're generating, even if you're in a service industry. And then Alex also pointed out that, and I think this is something that's very relevant for the modern conditions in the U.S., is that the kind of progress of capitalism constantly pushes the middle classes, like small owners, small business people, different types of professionals, we would say nowadays, kind of pushes them into the working class, into the proletariat. I mean, even high earning people in the middle class, like doctors and lawyers, technological and societal developments are increasingly proletarianizing them. Like pretty soon, there's going to be artificial intelligence software that can eliminate a lot of the law jobs. And all of a sudden, you're going to have quite a few lawyers that are finding less lucrative jobs, and this is going to grow the ranks of the proletariat. And that's just one small instance. This is happening all over the place. So we've got a couple of hands, and then we have a question in the chat that came in from Tom. Tom says, so why do the socialist revolutions always expand the state and its structures after seizing power? I thought the goal was to make the state wither away. Chrisley, do you want to talk about that, or shall I take that?
We can talk about it. The dictatorship of the proletariat is about not only the working class taking state power, but it's to put down the former ruling class, right? It's to put down the bourgeoisie. And while, so to understand this, you have to understand that there will still be a bourgeoisie. There will definitely be elements that, like leave the country, meet other ends. That's what would happen in a war, kind of no longer be as much of an issue, but you will actually still have, that same threat where you have to repress those forces. If you have other imperialist powers in the world still, they will be looking for opportunities to try to grow a counter-revolution in that country that had the revolution, right? And you would also, in the case of, we kind of mentioned, and then in the case of countries that need to also develop their means of production because they were underdeveloped, because they were semi-feudal, like China, or that's kind of the famous example. You would also still need a way to make sure that it's as the capitalist class grows, you also need ways to keep consolidating the power of the working class. So basically, they're expanding the state structures in order to keep the working class in power, even as the imperialist threat grows and as the conditions for as the forces of counter-revolution begin to organize. There's always a war when a country has a revolution. 14 countries invaded the Soviet Union after they had their revolution, and you don't learn that in school. you don't, just like, oh yeah, it's just the white army versus the red. No, how about like literally a dozen countries, invaded Russia, So, to deal with that and the forces that linger, you need some kind of state apparatus. And it's, China still has a dictatorship of the proletariat because they did that after Tiananmen Square when the forces of counter-revolution failed, right? And then the state realized they had to expand, they phrase it as enforce and expand law and governance, right? But we know who that law and governance is for, so.
And Josh wanted to speak to this question as well. So I'm going to unmute you, Josh. Or Jay, sorry.
Josh is good. The only point that I wanted to add to that, like you guys said most of it, is that if you want to read ahead, there's a later article about superstructure and the base that goes into it some. But the main thing is that, like, we're also talking about developing productive forces and planning an economy. So those are like planning the economy and putting it into a people-oriented mode is a tremendous organizational task. So there's not just the aspect that is of the state having to be an instrument of one class oppressing another, but also of it being an organizational body. So it actually has to organize socialist production, socialist distribution, and socialist planning. So, and that'll continue. And in a way, that organizational function will continue even when there is no state. Like, you'll have to set up, like a communist society won't be one without organization. It'll just be one without oppression.
Thank you. All right, I've got a question from David. I'm gonna unmute you, David.
Okay. Hello. During the presentation, a question occurred to me during your portion, Andy, and it's something that I've thought about before, but it had to do with the police in the United States. And I was wondering, by the way, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It's, I guess theoretically, what might, the lead up to the revolution look like with regards to police and the army, and then historically, if there are good examples of, what has happened in revolutionary situations that you could recommend. And I also haven't read the works you recommended earlier. I've seen them before. I'm getting them, but I'll just leave it there.
I can definitely tell you what happened in Russia, because I know about that pretty well. So in Russia, large sections, like entire divisions of the armed forces, joined forces with the revolution. So the army came over to the side of the people, I think in particular because they were some of the ones that were suffering the most from the war, and because they had broad conscription. So the armed forces in Russia at the time that were fighting in World War I were not, a self-selected group that wanted to be in the military. It was a whole bunch of people from, all across the country that were forced to be in the military. And I think this gave them a lot of revolutionary potential. Also, the fact that the militaries in general are trained and oriented to fight an external enemy, whereas the police are trained and oriented to police the people internally. So in Russia, in the revolution, the military joined forces with the revolution, but the police fought to the end, and that's who they were fighting against. When they took the Winter Palace, and then of course, they had a prolonged civil war of some of the people that were the most committed to the monarchy and to restoring capitalism. So I think, who can say how things will go down in the United States? We don't have a draft, and the ideological orientation of the armed forces is skewed to the right. But past revolutionary experience shows that it is possible to win over some of the armed forces to the side of revolution, and that it's much less likely with the police just because of their function. Chrisley, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, just a small thing. So in countries that have kind of like kind of stronger revolutionary movements than we have in the U.S. right now, they do get forces from the military that defect, and they do get forces from the police that defect, right? So, and then some they keep in there, like, okay, you stay in there, that you play a role from in there, and then some. And then it's actually good when they defect a lot of the times, because especially for the military, because they'll bring skills, right, that are kind of hard to come by. So that's something that other movements kind of see, and I think that we definitely, because if the forces are not on our side, they'll be on the other side. We want to break up kind of those forces as much as we can. And you're right that there's no draft. The military does recruit quite often, though, from kind of like poorer communities, right? Like I went to a pretty poor school, and they made everyone take the ASVAB, and then they called everyone afterwards if you scored in a certain way. So that might that might be important one day. But yeah, you're right. We'll see. We have to. Someone has to build it in the U.S. That's how we'll learn. How much we can do.
Yeah. All right, Eric, I'm gonna unmute you.
Hey, thanks, comrade. I had kind of a question and a bit of clarification. No revolutionary organization or no revolutionary people or revolutionary class chooses the context in which, or rather the conditions in which they make revolution. So, there's been a number of developments, in the past, 50 years that are worth, looking at. I remember just last week I was watching an interview with a former official of the German Democratic Republic, Socialist East Germany, who was taken on as a consultant by the FSLN, the Sandinistas, after they won power in 1979, and they were sort of wondering how they could organize their state, seeing as how the FSLN was a coalition of many different organizations, some coming from a communist background, some were, reformist socialists, others came from a Catholic background, etc. And they were trying to draw from the experience of Socialist East Germany, because the ruling party in East Germany was the Socialist Unity Party, which was a merger of the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party, right? So they were like, how do we make this work? How do we construct our state? So things don't always follow exactly the model of the October Revolution or the Chinese Revolution. And to get to the sort of the meat of my question, anytime there is a movement towards socialism in a country, it forces us to a certain extent to reevaluate theory and sort of try to understand in a Marxist-Leninist context what the contributions of each movement towards socialism is, right? And since Comrade Tom B is present, this is sort of maybe directed to him because he has direct experience with the Venezuelan revolution. So one of the central tenets of Marxism-Leninism, especially Leninism, is the fact that there's no electoral path to socialism. So, but the situation was different in Venezuela, in that Hugo Chavez was elected, and I forgot if it was in 98 or 99, and then as the Bolivarian revolutionary process developed, it seemed to open space for the development of a socialist alternative. And in the Bolivarian revolution, they have utilized the electoral lever to open up space to the masses of working people to try to build socialist institutions on the ground through the support of people that were elected to positions of power in the bourgeois state. So does this development of the Bolivarian Revolution along an electoral route, does this force us to reconsider central tenets of Leninism? And I'm real curious as to what Comrade Tom has to say about this, because he has extensive experience over there and has taken multiple trips to Venezuela. Thanks for your time.
Hey, Tom, I asked you to unmute.
So without putting a lecture together on the topic, I'll try to keep it short. So that's why I asked the previous question I asked too, because that's what's on my mind. The reason I keep going to Venezuela is not some soft spot for Venezuela, though I do like the place a lot. It's because I find it fascinating and interesting because it challenges how do Marxist-Leninists view making revolution and the science that we're attempting to apply. But for me, I think it keeps reinforcing the concepts that we use in terms of Marxism-Leninism. In terms of the electoral road to socialism, I try to read about and study. I'm not an expert on either of these, but I look at what happened in Czechoslovakia, which was like a bourgeois democratic republic before World War II. I think the only Eastern European society like that, actually. And afterwards, they elected, two parties, the Communist Party and I don't know if that's their exact names, but the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, the Social Democrats, to power. And then they formed a unity government and then unified into one party. So I think that's an example where the use of the electoral system and if you want to say the electoral road is a precursor to what's happening in Venezuela. And then, with Chile and the defeat of and murder of Allende, and then, the complete, scattering of the revolution in the short term in the 70s, that's the other one, and it's a much more negative lesson. In Czechoslovakia, the U.S. and Britain did try to overthrow the democratically elected government using very right-wing and some fascist forces, but the people took to the streets, the partisans came out with their weapons that they still held on to, and sort of militias defended the revolution. And again, I think there's similarities in Venezuela that Chavez certainly won an election, and then many of the left parties, which are important and organized, especially for being organized, they had to, Chavez had two experiences trying to unite the left to back up revolution. One was when he made an uprising and the left didn't really turn out with a few good exceptions. And so he went to prison. And then the next time with the elections, most of the left said, "Oh, you'll never win. You can't do it." And then when he did, he still reached out to them to move things forward. So there is that strong electoral component to what they're doing. But there's certainly been a lot of violence against the revolution. There's been armed defense of the revolution. When I've visited the National Electric Corporation on 2 occasions. It's run by workers. There are no management walking around with clipboards. It's all run, the whole grid, the whole system's run by workers and unions. And they told us during the last attempted coup attempt, which I was actually there during that, the right wing came out and tried to attack them at the headquarters of the electric company. But the workers' militia went to their lockers and took out their weapons and chased away, these people with long rifles shooting at them from highway overpasses. So I think sometimes people want to claim that Marxist-Leninists only look at socialism in terms of nationalized industry. We certainly think that's very important, but we want workers' power and workers' organization, and that's true both militarily and in the economy. We want many types of things, and again, Venezuela is interesting because they don't claim they have socialism. I heard Maduro give a speech in March when I was there. He said, we don't have socialism. We're trying to move towards it, and we have to build structures to do it and build our party and its base to achieve it. So, yeah, I hope that leaves people with more questions.
Thank you, Tom. And I think we'll...
Got one more hand that came up in the middle of that explanation.
Paul, I'm going to unmute you here.
Yeah, I did want to add to the first question where we were talking about the alliance between the proletarians and the peasants within the Russian Revolution. Because I've seen before, some people have talked about land distribution as sort of a alternative to national liberation, especially for indigenous people or other oppressed people within the United States. The reason why that you've seen land distribution amongst these communist countries is it's an agricultural policy that works for the peasants specifically. And what happens in these societies is as these, agricultural, usually landlords start buying up more and more land, and as peasants go poor because of bad weather conditions, famines, or what have you, usually the actual workers get kicked off the land that they need in order to grow the product. So that's why you see land distribution, even in modern Marxist-Leninist countries, which we've also seen all the way back into slave society. Like, this is the thing that started the Roman Civil War. I know there was at least a few examples in Chinese history well before the fall of the Qing Empire. It's important to understand that land redistribution is not a alternative to national liberation, especially for the oppressed people that live within the United States. Thank you.
All right. Do we have any other questions that folks wanted to ask? And it's 100% fine if it's, you don't know exactly how to ask the question, or if it doesn't use a lot of Marxist language or terminology. We want, we want to make these concepts accessible to people. So if there's something you just didn't understand in the presentation, we encourage you to ask. Tom, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So I just want to understand the last person who spoke. Their point is that you can't really have effective land redistribution, or what people today are calling the land back movement, without the revolution. Is that the gist of what you're saying?
No, sir. What I'm saying is I've seen people argue against land back by arguing for land redistribution. And what I'm saying is that they're not the same. So, for instance, land back would be for indigenous communities to take back, land that belongs to them, either through the treaties or, whatever their particular purpose is. Because sometimes land back can mean different things to specifically different indigenous communities. Land redistribution, however, is mostly just an agricultural policy to ensure that the people who are working the land and actually own land that they can work on. This is because in older societies, if they don't really have farm workers, that's a thing that really develops in capitalism. So they needed to have access to land in order to actually produce on that land. I.e., they're entirely separate. Land back and land redistribution are two very different things.
right, and Lauren asked if there's any videos or movies available I can watch to give you a basic knowledge of Marxist-Leninism. So our friend Vince, who is a comrade over in Chicago, makes audiobooks on his YouTube channel of these articles. So you can find like audio versions of these articles starting from the beginning. The What is Marxism-Leninism, all the way up through all the articles that we've discussed so far, and the articles that we haven't gotten to yet. And you can find that here. I'm going to drop the link in the chat, but the channel is called Tanky Talk. But that's the link. But if you search Tanky Talk on YouTube, you can find audiobook, basically, like, you know, him reading these articles. Because I also really, I learn very well from listening to things as well. But yeah, I would definitely check out that YouTube channel.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention that our group also has a YouTube channel that we've, I think, recently started making some like theoretical videos. We also did a lot of webinars in 2020 because of the pandemic. So, and we recorded a bunch of them. So I think that channel, people can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that channel definitely has at least some of the recordings, if not all. So yeah, that's a resource as well.
Thanks, Wesley. All right, so I think we're gonna wrap up this session. Thanks everyone for participating and being on. So next time, the next article that we're gonna cover in 2 weeks. Let me find. Okay, I'm gonna drop the link. But so the next one that we're doing is how we learn theory and practice. And so this is going to be about the what we call the Marxist theory of knowledge. Like how do people learn things? How do we learn things? How do we know theory is correct? And this is going to be a very important kind of prerequisite study to a concept and an approach to organizing that our organization takes very seriously, called the mass line. So we're kind of getting into a really practical, I think the next two studies are going to be, they're things that we use in our activism and in our mass work on a daily basis, really. So I'm very excited for those, and I hope you all come back and join us. Kay asked about Animal Farm, which does make Lenin and Stalin. No, thanks. Welcome. Yeah, so there's absolutely a ton of capitalist propaganda about Lenin and Stalin. It's almost like the more successful you are at building socialism, the more evil of a person you are, the capitalists make you out to be. So, either Josh or Tom, do you have like a, kind of a concise thing to point someone in the direction of? Chrisley, go ahead.
Yeah, a good starter work. It's not the best stuff you'll read, because the best stuff you'll read is, and should read, is what Lenin and Stalin wrote themselves, especially history of the CPSU. He actually gives a history of a very in-depth history, and the party wrote it too, but Stalin is credited as the main writer of the revolution. But a good starter work is Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti, because he writes it specifically to say, well, first of all, fascism and communism are not the same, and tries to prove that, and then says, okay, so if they're not the same, what exactly are they? We could definitely dispute some of the things he says about the Soviet, I think he says that, he's right that there's not as many people like in the gulags as, are claimed. And, the Soviet Union wasn't just like locking everyone in prison. There definitely, there was they were on the search for espionage from Nazi Germany, which, they found a bunch of spies that way. So, he's not the authority on the Soviet Union, but it's a really good book. So Black Shirts and Reds. And then I would say definitely reading the things written by Lenin and Stalin themselves will give you like a whole new view of who they were, because they were organizers too, they weren't just like theorists. So
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Same time tomorrow, 5 a.m.